Gonna we're gonna get going. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Frank Pizzo. I'm the head sailing coach at Bowdoin, and I've been the head coach up there for the past 12 years. And some of you guys I've gotten to see sail a little bit when we host our Polar Bear Open or whatever. So I was invited to kind of help give you guys a talk, just to do some team race talks, or talk today at least, and kind of go through some stuff. And I think I don't know. I figured I would talk a little bit about team racing in general, and kind of talk a little bit about team racing in college, and maybe kind of give you guys a little bit of a bigger picture perspective on team racing, if it's something that you're interested in getting into, and then kind of go through some of the basic rules of thumb that we kind of talk about all the time on our team, and then maybe watch a little bit of video to kind of help explain it. So I think we have about an hour, and hopefully this is helpful for you guys and whatnot. I'm sure you guys are all getting very good at this online kind of video conference stuff. But just a reminder, if you're not talking, if you can just kind of be muted. And if you do want to talk or speak up, just unmute yourself and feel free to ask questions or whatever. The other thing that's worth pointing out is I've if I look a little different, I've gone through some health stuff this winter, so I have no hair. But I'm on the mend and whatever. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys a heads up if I look different. That's kind of the deal. But yeah, I'm excited to kind of talk some team racing stuff with you guys. So I don't know. Does anybody have any questions for me kind of before I get going? I'll just give a minute to, and oftentimes I think what's helpful, we actually do a lot of Zoom meetings with my team. If you have a question, maybe just, if you put it in the chat function on the side, and I'm going to share some links with you guys kind of in that chat function. So if you have any questions, whatever, that's probably the best way to kind of do it. But yeah, all right. So obviously we're all kind of in the same boat in terms of like not being able to be on the water right now, and we're a little bit, obviously we're all bummed about that and disappointed, but I think there's a lot of team racing that really needs to kind of be learned off the water. And I'll try not to make this just me talking the whole time, but I think, it's a game and it's a discipline that you have to put a kind of lot of time into, both on and off the water, to learn. And, so at Bowdoin, we spend a lot of time, basically the entire month of February, when it's too cold to be out sailing for the most part. We basically spend the entire month of February doing a lot of fitness stuff, but we also do a lot of like in the classroom time learning. I think it's important that we're all speaking the same language. So we kind of do a ton of stuff with learning different terms. We do a lot of stuff with kind of learning the plays, and we spend a lot of time kind of like learning the fundamentals, so that when we get on the water, we can spend kind of most of our time kind of learning the techniques, or getting better at the techniques. And for the most part, we try to, use the time on the water to kind of reinforce a lot of the thinking and structures that we set up kind of off the water. So, and to kind of relate this to you guys, we at Bowdoin, I've had guys and girls on our team that have been, I think you guys are all from Cheverus or Southern Maine or Greeley, and we've had guys and girls on our team from all of your high schools, and I think that is great, and all have kind of come in with varying levels of team race experience, and we're very much kind of used to that. on our team, and I think the guys and girls who have done a little bit more team racing, sometimes it's really beneficial, and they kind of get the game, and they can kind of pick it up quickly. And sometimes people kind of come into college sailing with some I would say some bad habits that they learned, and we have to spend a lot of time kind of unteaching and then reteaching. So but I think, my point with just mentioning that is like, our team, and I know there's a lot of other teams that, you guys can kind of go on and join in college and be active members and active contributors too. And right now you have an opportunity to kind of learn the game and get better at team racing. And that's a really, I think that's a big advantage. And if you're planning on, sailing at the next level, team racing is only it's only having more of a presence in college sailing. So for the most part, by the time you guys are in college, we're going to have pretty much our fall season is going to be mostly fleet racing, and our spring season is going to be mostly team racing. It's going to mimic, I think, the high school sailing schedule a lot more. And we'll have both co-ed team racing and women's team racing. So that's a really, I think in 2 years, there's going to be a women's national championship for team racing. And that's a really great development. And I think for a lot of you guys, that just means there's going to be, especially the women, there's going to be a ton of opportunities to kind of be able to team race in college and get a lot of time kind of getting better at it. I think the other big thing to understand is like after college, for a lot of people, and we can see this with the guys and girls that are on my team, there's not a ton of guys and girls that like come out of college and buy a boat and are immediately kind of fleet racing with their own private boat. A lot of guys and girls kind of on our team have kind of flocked to the bigger cities, New York, Boston, San Francisco, wherever. And they end up doing a lot of sailing for yacht clubs, and they do adult keelboat team racing, and it's a ton of fun. It's 3-on-3 or 4-on-4. And it's just a really good opportunity to kind of sail at a high level without a ton of, without having to own a boat. And that's kind of what a lot of, our graduates, the type of sailing that they kind of do post college. So I think like big picture, it's an important thing to kind of think about, in terms of, maybe what you'll be doing in college sailing, and also like post college stuff. So, and for our team at Bowdoin, we spend, most of our fall season is September through the end of October, and that's all fleet racing. And then for us in November, we spend the first 2 or 3 weeks, basically until the Thanksgiving break. We do a lot of team racing. We do a lot of one-on-one stuff. We kind of like learn a lot of the skills. And then basically in the spring, we spend all of February kind of doing classroom stuff and time in the gym. And then March 1, we start practicing at our place. And then usually we go down to Florida for a week for team racing. And then we get back, and it's our full schedule. So it's a really big thing, I think, that we spend a lot of kind of time going through. And it's a really big part of what we try to be successful at. I think last year was the first time our team qualified for Team Race Nationals, which was a huge accomplishment in New England. There's basically 4 teams that qualify. And it was one of the last like national championships that we hadn't qualified for. So it was a big deal for us. But it kind of represented probably like a 10-year push to kind of get better and to build the institutional knowledge that was really critical for that group to kind of be able to perform at a high level. So so for you guys, what I would recommend is to use this time to start with your team, to kind of start developing the language that you guys want to use when you're talking about team racing, to spend some time kind of talking about the plays. And as you guys likely know, usually every year the same teams are often really good at team racing, and the teams that kind of struggle with team racing they're kind of the same groups. And if you want to break that cycle, you kind of need to develop, what we've kind of sorted out, which is a team race playbook and a really good culture that allows for good team racing on the water. And then, to kind of develop the structures that you really need to kind of get better. So, so I know that's kind of a lot of information. I'm happy if people have any questions about, college sailing, college team racing in general, or kind of team racing stuff we do at Bowdoin. I'm happy to kind of, answer any of that stuff, right now. So I'll give you guys a minute to maybe put something in the chat if you have any questions. Right, doesn't sound like it. So I'm going to share my screen for a second and kind of just give you a little bit of like what I'm talking about in terms of a playbook. So can you guys see my screen? Can I get somebody to just raise their hand if they see it? Okay, so this is our what we have as a playbook for our team for this past year that has been pretty truncated. So and I think a lot of this stuff, a lot of teams have pretty similar things to this, but we have a playbook that we spend a lot of time kind of going with our team and especially with our first years. So we kind of go through, the fundamentals, the basic rules of thumb, some basic tips. And then we spend a lot of time kind of going through, different terms and what we mean by that. Every team kind of has a different set of terms and kind of exactly what they mean. And we kind of go through that with our team, gap, gatekeeper, golden rule, kind of all this stuff. Then we kind of go through some general like mark traps and passbacks and pinning type things. And then we kind of go through some starting stuff. And then we go through a lot of the plays, right? And, a lot of you guys kind of know or have a good sense of this, the play 1, play 2, play 4 type stuff. And we're not going to really get into the nitty gritty of the plays and whatnot today. But we kind of go through all this stuff with our team, and at least this kind of gives us a foundation of what we're really trying to do with our group. And the nice thing about, Google Docs is you can have tons of different links and video stuff. And, this is a playbook that we've developed over time. And I would really encourage you guys, if you have the time to kind of do this, to put the investment in. I think this allows you to start to build your team race knowledge over the years. And, I know in high school sailing, you have both students that are in high school, but sometimes there's middle school students that are able to play at the same time. And, I think if you can develop your knowledge over a 4 or 6 or 7 year time frame, this can get pretty extensive and pretty good. So, I would encourage you to kind of take the time to kind of go through some of this stuff and to actually write it down. And a Google Doc's an easy way to kind of share it with different people and whatnot. So I kind of just wanted to show you guys a little bit of like what our playbook looks like. And I'm happy to share probably parts of that with you guys if it's something that we're interested in. But so yeah, today, I figured I would just kind of go through some of the rules of thumb that we kind of talk about a lot. I think kind of as we're kind of going through different scenarios on the water, we have like some guiding principles that we think are really important to kind of help sort us out in our decision making. And when we're doing drills, we try to like reinforce a lot of these rules of thumb. And they're relatively basic, but I think you can kind of get in pretty deep with a lot of them. So I think our first rule of thumb with our team, and just let me back up a second. So as as I'm kind of going through this stuff, I think one of the things that's important for you guys is, you know, hopefully you're maybe taking a little bit of notes and you're kind of like writing some of this stuff down, because I think that helps keep you engaged in some of the learning process, right? And I know for me, sometimes I can't always digest the information as I'm hearing it, but if I'm kind of writing down notes, you know, afterwards, I can kind of go through them a little bit, and that's kind of where, you know, where I personally kind of put some of the connections together. And if you guys have another meeting this week and you're trying to like digest some of the stuff we talked about, I think that could be a good way to kind of cycle back with some of this stuff. So I would encourage you, the best sailors, both on my team and on other teams, you know, like they have their sailing notebooks, they're taking notes, they're putting their brain to use. And you know, I say that all the time with my team. I'm like, hey, we need you guys to put your boat and brains to use, and really kind of learn this material. So yeah, so I think for us, our first rule of thumb in team racing is you should never give up. Team races, I would say way more than fleet races, are never over until they're over. And races can kind of turn around in a second, you know, especially if the racing is really close. And from a coaching perspective, what that looks like, when you can tell that people are not giving up, is that, you know, everybody in the boat is really engaged with sailing the boat really well, and they have really good body language in the boat. And by body language, I mean, like, how do you actually look in the boat? Are your shoulders up? Are you like paying attention to your jib and mainsail trim? Are you focused, or are you like your shoulders kind of hunched? And are you just kind of like mentally checked out? Are you checking out your sails and whatnot? And I think in team racing, you know, the races are 9 minutes. They're really short. They require a ton of focus. And if you don't have good body language, you're not going to win races, right? Like, your teammates really cue off your body language. And if you look like you don't care, it's really hard for your teammates to take you seriously, you know? So I think for us, that rule of thumb is of never giving up is super important. And that idea of having really good body language is so key. And for me, I think it's really important to have good body language during the race, but I am most keyed into my team after the finish. If we have bad body language after the finish, I'm going to get in my team's face about that, because that is something that we value, having good body language kind of after races, whether it was a great race or not a great race. Like, that is something that's like strikes at our core, you know, something that we really care about. And you know, if you're kind of giving up or quitting before the race is done, you're never going to win those races, you know? So for us, the body language is important. Sailing the boat really well is important, and kind of staying in the races. And I think a good example of this is I have a couple of good videos from the Rutland, the Team Race Worlds that were in Rutland, England, I think in 2015. What's good, it's drone video, and they have colored sails, and it's relatively easy to follow. So we kind of use this stuff all the time. But this is a team race in Fireflies. And these guys are on their final beat of the race. And you can tell from, you'll be able to tell from the video, and maybe I can make you guys all a little bit smaller, kind of how much the race kind of turns here. So the blue team rounded Mark 4, the final mark, in a 2-3-4, and it, you know, looks like they're going to be pretty close to a 2-3-4 here. Just to get you guys oriented, the finish line is here. And you can tell that the red team, kind of just the way the shifts have kind of worked out, that the two red boats on the right are looking pretty good, and are close to, you know, a 1-3 position, which is pretty powerful in team racing. But, you know, the blue team never gives up, and they kind of engage a little bit in an attacking duel, and then just kind of get, it looks like they're sailing in a little bit more pressure, kind of as they're kind of coming up to the finish line here. And what looks pretty dire initially for blue ends up being pretty good. So, still here, red looks like they're at a controlling position. I just kind of paused that, but blue's about to get back into this game here. On the left here, we have these two boats, red and blue. Port starboard might be able to draw a foul on that boat. And then blue is kind of just immediately getting right back into the game here. And this is like a common scenario where you have, if the race is close and the teams aren't kind of giving up, you could tell like blue went from, basically chasing to, finishing 1-2 or 1-3, and is able to kind of snag a good win, right at the finish there, and if we go back to like where they started, they were nowhere near being in a controlling position like that, so and this is a really common scenario that happens in team racing kind of all the time, where it doesn't look very good initially, and then if you kind of keep fighting and whatnot, you'll be able to get back in the race. So that first rule of thumb is never give up. And I think my last point with that rule of thumb is, that means you shouldn't bang corners. You shouldn't like mentally quit on the race. You need to like, if you were over early and you're chasing to try to get back in the game, it's your job to fight like you've never fought before, so that you can be rounding the marks like right behind the boat in front of you. It's a really important rule of thumb. So that's our first one. So any questions with that? Does anybody have any questions about that rule of thumb? I'm happy to kind of address that or take some time to talk about that. If you do, feel free to put it in the chat. Okay. So for us, our second rule of thumb, and this is a big one, I think, for a lot of people that have mostly done a lot of fleet racing. But in team racing, the play is almost always behind you. All right. So I think as you're kind of thinking about stuff and you're trying to figure out, hey, what boat are we trying to control, or where should we be kind of focusing our efforts? Unless you're in the 6, almost always the game is behind you. Right. So thinking about that is important. And with that, what we spend a lot of time kind of talking about is we want to ask our teammates that are the most advantaged to do the most work, right? So what I mean by that is if we have a teammate in the 6, right, they're the least advantaged boat on our team, we want to ask them to do the least amount of work possible. But if we have a boat that's in the 1 or the 2 or the 2 or the 3, those 2 teammates are our most advantaged boats, and they need to do the most work. So if there's a pass back that needs to happen, or if there's a mark trap that needs to happen, those are the boats that need to do most of the work, right? So I think it's an important, a general idea is the play is most often behind you. And then the secondary thing with that is your most advantaged boats need to do the most work in the team race. All right. So that's a pretty basic one. Our third kind of rule of thumb. So we say extend a winner, condense a loser. So if we're winning the team race, if we're in a play 1 or a play 2 or a play 4, so if we have first, second in any combination, or first and third in any combination, or if we're 2-3-4 or 2-3-5, then we want to make the race go as fast as possible. We want a fleet race. We want to, make the race go as quick as possible. And if we're losing a team race, then we want to make it go as long as possible. And we want the race to be as condensed as possible. So I think a good example of this is a common scenario if you're losing a team race is really trying to condense it, you know, and this video is from the Hinman Trophy, which is the adult team race national championship. They sail it in a variety of boats, but the year this was sailed in, it was sailed in 420s. So just to give you guys a little bit of the lay of the land, this is high number black versus maroon red. And boat 22 rounded the Mark II in the one, and they were 156. So they're in a losing combination. The red boats were in a 2-3-4 in a winning combination. And the red boats have kind of done a good job of splitting the first place boat, right? And putting a lot of pressure on them. But black number 22 ends up doing a really nice job of potentially compressing the race. And by compressing the race, I basically mean that, you know, the gap between this group of three and this group of three should be non-existent. If they're doing their job, they want to condense the race as much as possible. And they do that by just playing back, you know, playing back on boat 19 and trying to slow them down as much as possible. And we'll kind of see where this happens. Oftentimes races can get compressed around marks. And boat 22 does a really good job of just getting enough of boat 19 here to slow them down without 21 being able to kind of get control of them. And that allows for a really big compression of the race. It may not be enough to kind of get their teammates back in the game, but they do a really good job of just compressing the race here, so that, you know, they're putting their teammates in the best possible position to potentially get back in the race. And you can tell the way they round here is like, this gap between 19 and this next black boat is maybe 2 boat lengths, and that is much shorter than it once was. So, you know, a general rule of thumb is that when you're winning, you want to spread the race out as much as you can, go as fast as possible. And if you're losing a race, you want to have it as compressed as possible, and the race taking as long as possible. The red team ends up doing a good job of getting in front of 22 and whatnot, but it was a good video to kind of show, you know, a really big compression on the race course. So does everybody have any questions about that? Does that make sense? Compressing the racetrack. So that's generally our third rule of thumb. You know, our fourth rule of thumb is what we call the golden rule. So that's just do unto others before they do unto you. You basically want to control the boat behind you before the boat in front of you kind of controls you. And that's a general, it's kind of connected to that first one, you know, about mark traps, but you generally want to control the boat behind you. And I think for a lot of people in team racing, I think the most you can expect to control of another boat is one other boat. I think if you try to control more than one other boat, your likelihood of being able to do that is really minimal. So just controlling one boat, I think, is really important. And a good video to kind of show you guys this is another one from this Rutland team race. So we're at a windward mark here. And generally, you know, just controlling one boat is super important. So in this video here, you can tell at the top here, this red boat, they just want to control this one boat that's right to lord of them here. And boat 6, ideally, they just control boat 3, right? And if you can do unto others before they do unto you, you're going to be able to put yourself in a really good spot. You know, the first place red boat doesn't try to do too much. They just kind of round the mark there. And if you can kind of control the boat, one boat behind you, you're going to put yourself in a really good, you know, a really good spot. You know, and red here is in a 156. They're not trying to get, you know, they're not trying to control 2 boats. They're just really just trying to keep the one and maybe control one of the boats. You know, they're they're losing the race, so they're trying to condense it maybe to kind of get their teammates in it. But it's a good, I think a good example of just kind of, you know, do unto others before they do unto you. Just an important concept. You gain control of them. That's a huge advantage. So, yeah, we'll stop sharing there. But so yeah, that's another one of our major rules of thumb. So we're going to take a little bit of time right now, I think, to talk about communication, because this, I think, is a big one. And maybe we'll do some breakout groups to make this a little bit more interactive. So for us, we spend a lot of time on our team kind of talking about communication, both on when we're racing, after the races, when we're talking to our coaches, et cetera. And that, I think, is a really important thing to sort out. And sometimes we think there's good opportunities to have a lot of communication, and other times we actually want to have a little bit less communication. So maybe what we'll do right now is we'll just take 5 minutes. Let me see if I can do this. I'm going to, let me see something. Maybe not. Not sure. Bill, are you there? Are you able to set up like breakout groups, or is it, I don't see that on my toolbar. Do you see that or no?
Yeah, I should be able to do that.
Okay, so what we'll do is if you can just set up some breakout groups, and what I'd like the groups to kind of talk about is just communication while we're team racing. So what's effective communication between boats? Is there certain areas of the race course where we should be communicating? How easy is it to communicate on the water? And then after racing, what's effective to talk to our teammates about, and maybe what's not effective. And I just want to spend kind of 5 minutes doing this. So I'll type those questions in the chat so people can see it. And then hopefully we'll be able to kind of navigate through the different chats so that we could kind of maybe get some feedback. And then once we'll get everybody together, and we'll have everybody kind of each group, if you guys can just kind of present maybe 1 or 2 good takeaways that you had. So I'll put this in the chat as we're kind of sorting out these separate breakout groups. So I think that stuff's all really good. And I think you guys kind of hit on a lot of the big ones. For our team, we, like you guys said, our crews they do a lot of the in the boat communication. So they're talking about plays, they're talking about fleet race stuff. So puffs, what the current's doing, course geometry, how our teammates are doing. Oftentimes it's hard for the crews to know exactly like what the play is, but you can talk about like, hey, we're controlling 2 pairs on the right, and if I'm in a boat and we're controlling a pair, and that means our team's controlling all 3 pairs, then we're in a winning combination, right? So our crews are kind of the ones talking in the boat a lot, big picture stuff. For a lot of the time, but the communication between boats on the team, or communication with the umpires, we mostly do that with our skippers. And that's not because we don't think the crews are good enough to do that, but it's just a way to kind of like help assign responsibilities. So any communication, if we're doing umpire team racing, our skippers are the ones who are raising their hand to try to get the umpires involved. If they're trying to do certain mark traps, they're the ones kind of communicating with their teammates about that at the marks. Marks are a really key area of communication. It's usually when the boats are closest, and it's often the most easiest to communicate. We really try to avoid having our boats, our skippers kind of telling another skipper what to do during the race, I think that's really important. And if you find yourself doing that while you're practicing, I think that means that your team needs to kind of do a little bit more work off the water so that everybody kind of knows what they're supposed to be doing in particular plays. As you guys can, on the water, especially if it's windy, it's really hard to talk between boats, right? Like you can't hear them. It can be frustrating. You have no idea what they're talking about. And I think in those conditions, you know that you can't really communicate that effectively. So you need to do most of your communication kind of between races if you really need to kind of all get back on the same page with stuff. So, and I would say just in general with communication, it's important that like you're not shouting at your teammates, even if you're not meaning to yell at them, if you don't have any malintent, if someone's shouting at you, usually they're not going to respond well to that. And I think this is the same like when you're getting coached, right? If your coach is yelling at you, even if they're not even if they're not criticizing, usually your first response is to be like, to get pissed off, and you immediately stop listening, right? And I think that's the same thing in team racing, that if you're yelling at your teammate, they're not going to be listening to that, So I think that is really important, and especially after races, when you're talking to your teammates, if there's big mistakes that have been made, almost everybody knows when they've made a big mistake, right? So if there's a clear port starboard, you hit a mark and your team was winning and then you suddenly lost the race because of that, like telling your teammate not to hit the mark is not effective, right? And it doesn't really change behavior. That person almost always knows the mistake they've made. And I think that the big thing when you're talking to your teammates between races is not to point out their mistakes, but to focus on what maybe you thought the team did well. And if you are going to go into a little bit of a critical thing, criticize yourself, right? Be like, hey, we know we kind of screwed up that Mark 1. We weren't our winner mark there. We weren't on the same page as you guys. That's on us. We apologize, right? And then you move on, but pointing out your teammates' mistakes gets nobody better. And it really has no accountability. And then everybody's just like sailing back to the starting line, all pissed off and having bad body language and not getting better, right? So your communication, I think, is really important. The other trick, and this is something that, especially if your teams have been sailing together for a while, sometimes if a team is struggling a little bit and the skippers are kind of butting heads and not really talking to each other, one of the things that we found is really effective between races, especially when you're back on the dock, is to have the crews talk to each other, right? Sometimes you can get the boats to talk to each other via the crews. And it's usually, sailboat racing is a really emotional sport. And I think team racing kind of gets people pretty hot sometimes, pretty hot under the collar. And that's really common. But sometimes when people are really, mad or really overexcited, they can't really communicate effectively that well. And that's usually where on our team, we have our crews kind of help communicate between the boats. And that, that could be like, hey, on the starting line, our boats kind of keep running into each other and we're not able to kind of get off the line effectively. And this is why our boat thinks there's an issue. And then they can have a constructive conversation that then can get brought back to the boats that they're sailing in and improve from there. So that's, from our end, that's a little tip that we use, especially when we're kind of struggling a little bit with our communication. But, I think you guys kind of nailed a lot of the big pieces. It's just effectively, implementing that stuff. And one of the things, one other tip I would say is if after racing, your team is really struggling with not kind of playing the blame game or not, just kind of offering not very constructive feedback. And this happens on our team quite a bit sometimes, is we don't allow the team to communicate after the races. What we do is, as our thing is, if we're in that position, we have the team that's racing do five, if it's a downwind sail back to the dock, they have to do 5 dives back to the dock, and they're not allowed to talk to each other until they get back on the dock, right? So you immediately kind of finish a race, and whether it was a race you won or a race you lost or a race you're super excited about or a race you're super pissed off about, whatever, you move on and you focus on the boat handling stuff. And then that usually that like 1 to 2 minutes of just kind of doing jives or doing tacks kind of helps settle people a little bit, and they get back to the dock, and then they're in a much better mental space to kind of have, an effective, constructive conversation about maybe what can be done differently or whatever. So that's another little tip that we use for our communication stuff, that can be pretty helpful. So I don't know, does anybody else have anything to add in terms of communication? It's something you're going to be working on a ton, and really good teams are effective with their communication, and they're constantly talking about it and getting better, and when they kind of have a shortcoming with it, they're able to address it and kind of move on in positive ways. But does anybody have anything to add to that? Doesn't seem like it.
I think just really emphasizing the importance of the crew's role and getting the crew to really speak up, especially I think with our high school program, a lot of the newer sailors end up crewing. So just making sure that those guys aren't going along for the ride and giving them as much of a voice as the skipper is huge.
Yeah. And what I would say to that, and we have the similar situation with like new crews kind of joining our team, is that what we really say for our new crews is like, hey, we want you talking, and we give them like really specific things we want you talking about, right? So you may not know what the combo is, but hey, we want to know like where the other boats are, right? So we could be pointing that out. Hey, we want to know about, the where it's windier and where it's less windy, right? And that's really easy to tell based on how dark the water is, right? So, or if you feel the breeze on your face, like you need to speak up with that. And the only way you get better at communicating is actually saying it out loud. And if you're just a quiet or a mouse in the boat, you're not getting better at that. So I think if you're sailing with somebody who's new and they're like, hey, I don't really know what I should be saying, or hey, I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't want to look dumb in front of you, I'd be like, hey, I need to know 3 things at all times. I want you to be talking about where the mark is, right? I want you to be talking about maybe where the breeze is coming from and where the other boats are, right? And if you kind of are able to and those are all things that anybody with any sort of experience can kind of get a sense of, and help communicate. And that will start that process of communicating in the boat. And then you'll get better at like, figuring out pairs or what the combos are and all that, but you got to start somewhere. And I think to start somewhere, it's like very specific. This is what I'm looking for, and after the race, if you're still really quiet, like, hey, we got to get better at this, so I need you talking during the race about this stuff. So that would be my advice with it, to get the crews talking. The crews in team racing are so important. And with that being said, I think this is another valuable thing that our team does related to communication and building good relationships, is we have multiple crew appreciation days during our team race season, right? And for us, these are really good team activities. When we do these crew appreciation days, we have every skipper kind of paired up with the crew, and the skippers either have to, give the crew that they sail with kind of all the time, like a small snack, or recite them a poem, or sing them a song, or something like that kind of shows their appreciation for the crew that they sail with. Our crews love it. Our skippers love doing it. And it's just a nod to our crews that when they're team racing, they get beat up. It's really hard to be a really good team race crew, and we need to acknowledge that. And our team does that through these crew appreciation days, and they're super easy to organize, and the team loves it. And I would highly recommend doing that on your guys' teams as well. So I know that is a bit of a tangent. So yeah, we just have a couple of minutes left. And maybe I'll just kind of save, like, kind of getting to, like, I have a couple more of these rules of thumb. So I'll just try to go through a couple of these kind of quickly. So on our team, for team racing, we avoid contact on the water. A, it helps preserve our boats. B, when you guys start getting into umpired team racing, if there's contact between two boats, almost always the umpires have to get involved. And for team racing, if the competitors kind of sort out the foul, it's a 360. If the umpires are initiating a penalty, it's a 720. Much bigger penalty for a 720. So avoiding contact at all times is really important. With that, we kind of use the adage like rules are our shield, not our sword. So if we kind of need to use the rules to gain control of another boat, we're not in a great enough position for that. So that's something we talk a lot about. And maybe the last one that's kind of worth talking about is just starting. Starting is super important. And if you can get if you can get 3 boats off the starting line, you're going to be in a really effective way to kind of win a lot of races. And if you get 2 boats off the starting line, your chance of winning the race is gradually diminished. If it's just 1, you're likely not winning the race. And if no boats get off the line, you're definitely not winning the race. So, I have one more video from the Rutland team race, just to start. And I think it's kind of a typical one, where things are kind of, unfolding a little bit. They're inside of 50 seconds, kind of coming into their final approach to the line. And I could spend a ton of time kind of going through different starting techniques. But, in general, a really good start is when all 3 boats are off the line going fast, at least bow even with their opponents. It doesn't matter necessarily if you're on starboard or port, but just kind of getting off the line clean is really important. A really good visual of where this starting line is. This red boat to port here is in trouble. They're in big trouble here, and it looks like they're maybe going to escape, but they're going to be late. And if generally team race starting lines are much shorter, so it's much easier to have a sense of where the actual starting line is. So ideally, you don't want to be over. But in this spot here, we start and boom, blue is off pretty clean, and red is got 2 boats off, with the 3rd boat chasing, so red is instantly in a little bit of a tough spot, and blue is in a decent position here. But, generally speaking, blue had 3 boats off the line there. Red had 2 boats off the line. But not a terrible start. Everybody's kind of within a boat length or 2 of the line. And I think your goal on your team is to just get your teammates off clean, going fast, bow even, and a little bit spread out is really important to kind of being effective, and so that's kind of, a good overhead view of, not a bad start. And then getting a clean start allows you to kind of put yourself in a position to have a play by the time you get to mark 1, So yeah, there's a couple of other, rules of thumb that I'll share in the chat with you guys, like my notes here. It's a little bit about bad positioning and thinking as a team, etc. And all these videos will kind of be in the chat as well. So, just some general rules of thumb that like I said, we kind of go over with our team, before the season starts. And then as we're kind of going through stuff on the water, we're always kind of coming back to the rules of thumb. When we have questions like, oh, what do we do in these situations? Like just falling back on these general rules of thumb so that we know, what our deal is. And it kind of keeps us kind of going back to our fundamentals. So we have a good sense of what's happening. So yeah, I know we're maybe just a minute or 2 after 4, but if you guys have any questions for me about what we talked about today, I'm happy to kind of answer them right now. And I posted a good slideshow from Steve Hunt, who is the coach at Point Loma High School out in California, and they've won a ton of team race national champs. Really good resource there. And then just some of my notes for our talk today. But I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has anything for me.
Is there any like surprise information that most sailors, probably crews in particular, don't think to give their skippers or teammates during a team race that is kind of underlooked and should be emphasized more than it often is?
That is a good question. I think the best crews in college for team racing, um, especially when the boat is going slow, when the skipper's trying to get the boat going slow at mark traps, if you're doing pass backs, whatever, the best crews are able to anticipate when the boat is about to stop in the water, right? And they're able to kind of continue to get the boat moving when you're in that really slow stop position, before you start going in reverse and then you're like super, super slow and you can't do anything. The best crews are able to communicate that to the skipper, like, hey, we're getting too slow right now. We need to get the boat moving, and that is a really hard skill set to develop, but oftentimes you can kind of get a sense of where your boat, how slow your boat is going kind of relative to the boats around you, or you kind of have that feel in the boat like, hey, we're about to be fully stopped here, and we don't ever really want to be fully stopped. So I think that's one of the things I think the best crews are really good at, just communicating that and not letting the boat get too slow. I think the really good other thing that really good crews are able to do is they know the game just as well as the skippers, so they know the plays just as well. They know what mark traps they're going to be trying to do, and they're communicating that to the skipper maybe even before the skipper is actually doing it. I think that is a really powerful thing. And I think the last thing I would say that the really good crews in college are able to do is when you're team racing and you just need to go fast, right? Like it's just like a boat speed race. The really good crews are able to help get the boat going as fast as possible. So that's like your effective jib trim, your effective vang trim, where you're sitting in the boat, all of that stuff. If you're the fastest boat on the race course, right, you're going to be in the one, right? You're going to be your most advantaged boat, and that's a really powerful position to be. So I would say those are the big things: knowing the game really well, knowing when you're getting too slow, and knowing how to make the boat go as fast as possible. If you're able to do that as a crew, you're going to be a crew that everybody wants to sail with, right? So, and I know that's probably basic, but really hard to do. Easy to say, really hard to do. Yeah.
Do you think that like general like boat speed skills and like flow awareness as a crew can be transferred directly from fleet racing, or are there like modifications that need to be made to apply those skills to a team race?
I think it's direct from fleet racing, but it's a much smaller race course, right? So you don't have like a typical high school sailing windward beat is maybe 4 to 5 minutes, whereas in team racing it's a 1 minute beat, right, or a 2 minute beat. So I think everything's kind of compressed. You have to be able to kind of like get the boat going fast and get it in the groove much faster than you do fleet racing. I think the other thing you have to be able to do as a crew when you're team racing versus fleet racing is you have to be able to anticipate maneuvers with a lot less communication from your skipper, right? So if you're fleet racing, you're sailing upwind, skipper's like, hey, we're gonna tack in 3 boat lengths, right? And like, all right, we're gonna tack now. In team racing, oftentimes your skipper's not even telling you when they're tacking, like the boat is turning, right? So you have to anticipate like, hey, when the jib starts to bubble past the telltales, like we're tacking, right? So you just have to be like a much better, I think everything's just kind of like compressed when you're team racing. You just have to be able to anticipate a little bit more and do it on a much smaller race course. So there, a lot of the skills are really, really similar, but they're just kind of in hyperdrive, if that makes sense. Yeah. Good questions. Anybody else? Yeah, I would just say, like I said in the beginning, I would just use this as an opportunity to kind of get better and learn the game. I know it sounds like you guys have some opportunities to work with Dave Perry, who's like one of the best rules guys and one of the best coaches. I've done a lot with him, and so I would pepper him with questions, and it's just a really good opportunity to kind of learn the game and to kind of build the stoke. And hopefully when you guys are on the water in early May, you're able to kind of take advantage of that and just appreciate the time you get to be on the water. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Frank. This has been really great. We really
Yeah, that was
appreciate it.
great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
appreciate you guys having me, and I'm happy to help out wherever I can, and good luck with stuff.
Great.
All right.
All right. Well, yeah, take care.
Sounds good, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.